Welcome back, everyone. Glad to hear you. Glad to have you here with me today on this beautiful spring day we're having. So, today, let's kind of go into more depth with um, our concepts that we're trying to understand, the pieces that we're putting together about us, who we really are, and why we think the way we think, and why we believe the way we believe, and why we operate the way we operate. In other words, what are the factors going on inside of us that give us the results we have in our life? It all comes down to our subconscious mind and what we learned first. I am the Subconscious Healer. This is the Subconscious Healer podcast. Dr. Gabe Roberts. Today, let's kind of take this further. First off, let me give you a couple of examples of some things that have happened with a client of mine and one with my own example. I'll just simply say this. If I try to get started on my own, I'll crash. A businessman once came to me with complaints of anxiousness whenever I had him fill out the paperwork for reasons for psychosomatic care. He wrote anxiousness, and he was a partner in multiple successful businesses. However, for a year, a little bit more than a year, he had wanted to start another business. And every time he attempted some kind of action, some kind of step towards organizing the company, getting things running, getting the pieces laid out that he needed, and getting things into operation, he'd always like seemed to run into some kind of powerful wall of procrastination. So that's what he described it as, was a powerful wall of procrastination. And if he tried, like many people do, and they're encouraged to do, is push through it. As he started the steps of trying to move and take action, he would get these panic attacks. So through my screen, we meet. As we start, I kind of explain to him the rules of what we're going to do and how things are going to be. And of course, I don't have any idea about why this is going any more than he does. So we take him back to one of the moments when he first felt this feeling. The last time he actually had that feeling, a key event, and suddenly we take him back to a bank and he's trying to open a business account. So from there, we have a feeling established. I know I'm in a secondary sensitizing event, not the initial wound. So we ask his subconscious to take us to the first time, the key event that had everything to do with this feeling that he was experiencing while he was in the bank and what was causing him to go into these panic attacks. And what happened was uh, his subconscious mind takes us right to it. I ask him a few questions. I say, all right, first impressions in this moment your mind has brought you to, are you indoors or outdoors? He says, outdoors. I said, are you alone or with people? He pauses for a long time and suddenly he has this frown on his face. And he says, there are people around, but I still feel kind of alone. And I said, okay, um, give me a report, share me what's going on. Then his face kind of solidifies, his face kind of normals out, and he says, we all have bikes. And I say, well, what's happening in this circumstance when you all have bikes? Suddenly he realizes the moment had all the holographic imprint had really come into his awareness now. He realized he was a young boy. It was Christmas morning, and we all got bikes. And now he's really coming out being enthusiastic. Just what you could expect a child to feel in the same situation on Christmas morning and realizing they all have bikes. However, his voice went from feeling enthusiastic to suddenly kind of a frustrated panic. And he says, all their dads are helping them. And I paused for a moment and I said, okay, how about your father? Is your dad around? He's talking. My client responds to me. Okay, well, he's talking to. Give me a report and share with me what else is going on. And then he says, to his utter surprise, I try to, and then he starts to cry. So this grown man starts to cry in front of me through a Zoom meeting that is describing Christmas morning. We all had bikes, and he indicated that everyone around, including his neighbors and friends, their fathers were working with them, but his dad was busy. And when he realizes that his dad's not helping him, he starts to cry. Now, stay with me a moment. You'll see why. To save you this, incredibly slow paced nature of this, what had come out of this, what had happened was he had grown tired of waiting for his dad working on the bike, helping him put the bike together. So he started to put it together on his own. He mounted the bike, he put everything together on his own. And then it's like the whole community, because he lived in a small community, like a compact area with lots of neighbors around. And the minute he starts to ride the bike, the bicycle started to come apart. One wheel came off, the training wheel went off, and the bike tumbled sideways onto the street. And the whole community outside, watching all of their kids ride their bikes on Christmas morning, um, noticed that he was there, fallen over with his bike, crumbled into pieces. And all the people came over and they tried helping him and everything else. And as he was explaining this, I asked him, what's happening as this is going on? And he said in this most, little kid, little boy voice, if I try to get started on my own, I'll crash. And that perception that had happened to him when he put his own bicycle together and went to go ride it and it crashed in front of the community, causing a tremendous amount of embarrassment, was in fact the same imprint that was plaguing him years later as a successful business person, from being able to go through the plateau, bust through that ceiling to open another business. It was the exact same imprint. So we had changed that perception. And with that, suddenly he found him, the young boy, enthused and appreciating all stages of learning and achieving. And without a second session, he was on his way, moving forward and getting his business up and running. And now what happened is his same agency of the mind, his subconscious, that had been holding him back, become, keeping from him doing this, sabotaging his efforts, creating panic when he would try to push through that wall of procrastination, suddenly became a huge contributing force, helping him in all manners to manifest his vision. And he thought this was amazing. And when we discovered our post talk of how everything went, um, something so ordinary to childhood could create such a building block of holding back, such a building block of procrastination. He kept telling me over and over, look, please don't tell me that that little thing on Christmas morning created this much chaos. And that's just the thing to understand. That's the thing that understands how the mind interprets these life experiences, and it can create limitations that show up later in our life. Um, that's what it was. If I try to get started on my own, I'll crash, was something that his subconscious had learned and processed and interpreted, and had built up enough times through the years that here he was, a successful businessman, hitting a plateau, not being able to go farther than he was, and than he was envisioning, than his intentions were allowing. Some of the work, most of the work I do is based on resolving trauma, but I do a lot of performance enhancing work too. And this is just an example of that. Now, let me share with you another example. Imagine this scenario. Okay. It's a beautiful spring day outside, sunshine, slight breeze. The change of season is now completely taken over with newly sprouted flowers and green leaves showing up all over the trees. And you could tell the winter has completely passed. You could just smell the fresh flowers, the fresh vegetation in the air. And with that, I was excited to go pick up my children from my former spouse's house. My wife, Tiffany, and my daughter, Aria, was a baby at the time. And we're driving. I had a large SUV at the time, a Nissan Armada, and we're on the way to go pick up my kids for a weekend of fun. And this was, 9 years ago, roughly. Driving down the road, beautiful day, excited about picking my kids up, excited about the weekend we're going to have together. And out of nowhere, this rock just hits my windshield. And it was a good sized rock. hits my windshield. It's a loud thud, and the windshield did not crack. So my windshield did not have any damage from this rock. But suddenly, I was just seized up. I could feel everything in me tightening and getting very tense, and I could just feel my face going flush. Everything was just hot, and I was just gripping the steering wheel very tightly. Now, this was right after I'd picked my children up. So I went to go pick them up. Everything was great. I'm enthused. They're in the car. We're all having a good time. We're on the way back to our beautiful house in Kansas City, and that rock hits the windshield. Suddenly, everything shifts. In this moment, it's fair to say that my brain, my entire nervous system, all my physiological functions, my biochemistry in my body was all in the grips of my distant past, from a very early experience in life. You could say I went through a psycho emotional time warp, just like the businessman I was discussing, instantly without any choice or form of recognition, separating me from that present moment with my family, separating me from that weekend, from having my kids in the car, being so enthused about the weekend. Suddenly, all that changed with just a rock hitting the windshield. And if you've read my book and you've read the first chapter, you can probably understand the traumatic wounds that I was carrying and how easily something as mundane as a rock hitting the windshield could trigger all that to come back. And that was until Tiffany, my wife, knew me well enough to whisper in my ears. I'm driving, gripping the steering wheel, hot. Everyone in the car, my kids, could feel that sudden enthusiasm energy to sudden just anger from a rock hitting the windshield. My wife reached in gently and whispered, "Don't ruin this weekend for your kids." And that was enough to kind of snap me out of it. That was enough to kind of get me to realize, oh man, what am I doing? Let's start focusing on other things. And over time it kind of fizzled down. But that was the wound that I was carrying. And that was what had just impacted me, making me go through this psycho emotional time warp that without any recognition, without any kind of choice or anything, suddenly brought me back to the past without him having any idea of it. Similar to the businessman that I was just describing. And that is why that's how trauma will show up in our life. These are both circumstances of trauma. However, one of them is obviously big T and one of them is little t trauma. The trauma that he endured from his dad not helping him put his bicycle together, going out, doing it on his own, having the bike fall apart, having him collapse on the street in front of the entire community with the embarrassment and the notion of, if I get started on my own, I'll crash, I'll fail. And that just further impacted him years later, just like my circumstance of having a rocket to windshield brought all this anger right up to the surface. See, trauma is it defined as the green work is a wound. And whether we understand it or not, our pain, our discomfort, our agony, our whatever it may, our perception that are all from this womb, it will determine how we cope with life in all aspects. From this businessman not being able to get past the glass ceiling to me suddenly having taken me out of that moment of pleasant spring day to suddenly being angry driving just from a rock hitting the windshield without doing any damage at all, without cracking the windshield or nothing. And that's through our behaviors, our habits, how we see things. Those traumas will directly influence and skew and color and filter and wash out all our potential thinking about the world that's around us and our place in it. So, like any injury, it will always hurt until it's properly healed. It'll hurt anytime it gets poked. See, this guy at a bank trying to get a loan, that poked him. A rock hitting the windshield, that poked me. In the case of all our childhood trauma, this wound is dealt to us at times when we're so young and neurologically malleable. Our brain and our nervous system is not even mature enough. It's not even mature enough to understand any kind of verbal communication. And what happens is anything that happens to us gets imprinted as a subverbal holographic wound. And they're etched in during these times of conception until around the age of 5. And they remain imprinted in deeper levels of our mind and our body, and sometimes the spinal cord, the brainstem, far beyond any kind of scope aware language or any kind of spoken words or cognitive ability, any kind of thinking, our rationality, far beyond what that has access to. So this means of the wounds imprinting during these years stored in our body, it's inaccessible to us with our conscious awareness. It's completely out of our reach with us trying to think and talk about it and use any kind of spoken language. It's out of that jurisdiction. That's why talk therapy many times is ineffective, inefficient. It can be beneficial for people that need to vent. They have something they want to get out. They need to release the energy. And in the presence of somebody who's compassionate listening, it can be healing. But does it heal the wound subverbally? No. Does it heal the wound from 0 to 5? Absolutely not. So that's what our work in psychosomatic work does. That's what holographic manipulation therapy targets in all levels of getting access to that subverbal area in a language and a coding system that it understands and completely neutralizing that. In our book meeting, and the book that I had put out, people have given me fantastic feedback about how suddenly they're not triggered. They're just following the instructions in the book. They're not even really sure what they're doing. They're just following the instructions and they're participating with what's going on, what the instructions say. And suddenly they're noticing, hey, I'm not triggered as much. Things on the outside don't bother me as much. Why? Because they're healing that wound, that persistent psychic spontaneous state of self-hypnosis. That's what it is. And during the overwhelm, there's a fraction of a second. Our consciousness goes into an altered state, and we encode all that emotion and all that pain, all that disappointment, perhaps within or around the body as a holographic imprint. And that's why if you're reading my book, you'll notice that it's not working inside your body, it's working both in and out of your body. And that's because of this torus field that surrounds us, this toroidal field that comes from our heart. Just Google human torus field, and you'll see that there's an immense energetic field around us that's 8 to 10 feet in diameter. And it is like an information processing, coding, recording system. Everything that happens to us that we feel within our body also happens within this energetic field. And that's why you can sometimes feel somebody else's mood. It has nothing to do with what's going on with their physical body. It's this field that's outside of them that you're actually detecting. Our proprioceptive nervous system actually is capable of picking up that kind of data. So this wound, this trauma, this holding pattern, it's just a pocket of frozen consciousness that uh, stays persisting until it sometimes exaggerates our response to environmental or sometimes internal stimuli and in highly inappropriate and disproportional ways. So that's the example of the businessman, suddenly hitting a moment where um, he could not he could not open that business because of some invisible force holding him back, and it all had to do with um, him building a bicycle on his own because his father was busy, this bicycle falling apart, and all the embarrassing circumstances in in that moment, whenever the bike fell apart and he fell in front of the entire community, had basically translated into an inappropriate or disproportional action as a professional decades later, not being able to open a fourth business. And another side of just looking at this, how this occurs, and why the body, why the subconscious is doing exactly what it's designed to do, is it's doing this to protect you. So, observing through the lens of this persistent wound um, determines whether we're capable of gathering rational and generating rational thought, or or having this wound suddenly rear its head and influence our current activities, our relationships we're going on with our friends, our family, and just like my example of suddenly leaving the car, so to speak, leaving that Nissan Armada, driving with my family, suddenly leaving that thing and having my mind go into all sorts of atrocities and mischief in just a moment, all because of a simple rock hit the windshield and didn't damage it. So this is how trauma is capable of um, causing these things to suddenly be relived in our body. And again, these are completely out of our awareness. So the conscious mind that we're all aware of is explicit memory, and that's the only proverbial tip of the very deep and mighty iceberg, in the words of Peter Levine. It barely hints at the submerged striata of primal implicit experience, and that moves us in ways the conscious mind can only begin to imagine. That means that whenever we have an awareness of something, that's just a very, very tip of a very, very deep iceberg. So let me say this another way. Each moment that passes through our nervous system, that passes through our five senses and through our proprioceptive nervous system, tremendous amount of information comes in. 2.3 million bits of data per second. And it's drawn through our nervous system through our five senses and through our proprioceptive nervous system. And this tremendous amount of data is interpreted and it's ran through, calculated, and controlled all by the subconscious mind. Everything from the wind blowing through the trees, you causing to see the trees sway and move, neighborhood dogs barking, the rush of air that contacts your face as a bus drives by, the muffled noise of the crowd of people surrounding you at a restaurant or a local coffee shop. All of these things going on around you is summarized by that 2.3 million bits of data per second. And you are only consciously aware of 126 bits of conscious awareness. And by the way, that conscious awareness that you're aware of has already ran through all of your perceptual filters, every little wound, every trauma, every hurt, every betrayal, all the things that that businessman and myself have ever went through, for those experiences to come out in the way we interpret it. We each interpreted those two events differently, but it all comes out of that 126 bits of conscious awareness in a colored, skewed way. So our conscious mind is a rational, lying mind. And when you look at things like how the mind works, phobic cases, people who have phobias, are great tools for explaining this. Fear of heights. Okay. Um, the more that you understand the mind model, the more you can understand what traditional medicine in our country is missing, um, because they don't understand the way these things work. If we are going to work with somebody that has a phobia, what we have to do is we cannot do it with the conscious mind. We can't do it with the rational mind. We have to do it with the larger subconscious mind. So, usually in phobic cases, when I'm working with someone, I'll have them take me back to the last panic attack they had. And this usually gets the patient feeling pretty anxious or whatever. Then I ask the mind to take us back to the last time they felt this feeling. And it could take us back to hours or days to the last time he or she had that, or it might take us back to years. So the subconscious mind may take us upon it may take it upon its own to take us back, not to the actual last occurrence, but to some event where the feeling might have set an all-time mark for intensity. Now, these are all good things that it may do. And what happens is if we don't get to the initial seed planting, we're just doing surface level work. And remember, we don't have to act as if we know and we have a single clue where that initial wound may be. We just ask the subconscious to take us to the first event of significance. Wherever the mind is going to take us is where I'm going to go. I'm not in charge of the mind. I'm not in charge of where it takes us, but my intent is very clear to get us back to the significant scene. And whenever we find ourselves in that regression scene, what we do is we ask a few questions. We figure out if we're at some surface level or if we're at the actual key event itself. And the person is, they're sitting there just kind of responding yes or no. They really don't know where or what's going on, because sometimes we might go to when they were a 28-year-old or when they were an 8-year-old or when they were in the womb. Sometimes maybe whenever they'll go back to a previous generation. Suddenly they might go back to grandma or grandpa, and it may take them a while to realize this, but this happens maybe 30% of the time. And when you look at the holographic nature of our universe, how things are interconnected, and even how memory is even theorized to exist, it makes sense that it may be us, it may be something resonant with us. I had a client once who had really bad stomach pain, really, really bad stomach pain, and nothing seemed to work. Like nothing was helping her. Doctors did all kinds of things, procedures, and she saw some natural based doctors, and nobody could figure thinking out. There was no scans that gave any kind of clear picture. There was none of that. And whenever we did some regression work, suddenly she found herself kind of like in a downtown Chicago type setting with gangsters and suits. And, she thought she was making the whole thing up. And I was being a detective. I was saying, has your mind taken us to the event, or is it taking us for a runaround? Is it basically taking us somewhere else other than kind of as a distraction? Because sometimes it will do that. And she indicated that this was definitely where we needed to go. This was the key event. She could just know that we're on the right track. And suddenly here we were visiting a scene where these two gangster type people were interacting with each other, these two men, and one of them betrayed the other, and he actually shot a business partner. He shot this guy in the stomach, and that's where all her stomach pain came from. So, as as odd as that may sound to some people, and um, as difficult it might be for anyone to understand, those things can happen. That's how interconnected our subconscious mind is, and that's how resonant these memories can be. Let me just give you another example through how these memories are formed and formulated through what's called morphic resonance. Um, there was a man named William McDougall who uh, was from Harvard, this professor, and he wanted to study if rats could pass intelligence down to their offspring. So he put together this water maze contraption. And as the rats would go through this water maze, there was one of two exits these rats could get out of to exit the maze. And as he let these rats go through the water maze, he counted how many times it took before the rat only exited out of the desired hole, the desired exit William McDougall wanted the rat to go out of. And it took around 230 tries the first time, 230 or 240 tries as he counts. He could drop this rat off anywhere in the maze and would only go to that spot. It took 240 tries before the rat successfully did it each and every time. Then he takes the offspring of that rat because rats have, fairly short gestational periods. They reach sexual maturity fairly quick, and through a series of months, we can watch the entire lifespan of a rat, and it can give us a lot of ideas on how they live their life. There's been a lot of studies from that. Um, so he takes the offspring of this rat, runs it through the exact same maze, and counts again. And the offspring of the first rat went shorter. Now it took around 190 times before the rat only exited out of the out of the correct hole. He takes that rat again, runs it. He takes the offspring of that rat, rather, runs it through the same water maze. So now we're talking three generations of rat. Runs it through the water maze the third time, and now it's around 140 times. So each time it's getting better and better and better. It's like there's been offspring have inherited some kind of intelligence from their parent through this. That's what it was seeming to kind of appear like. That is until another professor in Australia looked at William McDougall's work, was fascinated by it, wanted to reproduce it, creates the exact same identical water maze, the same blueprints, puts together the same water maze, and uses the same species of rats and starts dropping them in to count. And this guy in Australia, a whole different continent away, his rats start at where William McDougall's left off. So his rat starts where William McDougall's in Harvard left off. So memories are not necessarily something that is imprinted in the brain. It's not necessarily something that's just imprinted in our body. Memories are something else entirely. It's like whenever a memory happens, it gets uploaded into like a surfer in the like a cloud surfer in the atmosphere. And whenever we recall that back, we can recall it back and it can influence our body in certain holographical ways. And that's kind of what to keep in mind here. In my book, I even point that out that if you're clearing trauma out of your body, keep an open mind that sometimes the trauma that you're attempting to clear out may or may not even be yours.